Skillshare is for designers, photographers, marketers, artists, and lifelong learners. Skillshare is for foodies, commuters, risk takers, the young, and the young at heart. It's for strategists, free spirits, purists, the bold, the curious, the characters, the makers, and the breakers. Skillshare is for everyone, an online learning community with thousands of classes to advance your career, improve the world, and pursue the work you love. What will you learn next? It all starts on Skillshare.
Hi. In this sequence, we're going to be discussing the sentence fragment. And as you saw on the slide, the opening slide in the sequence, a sentence fragment is a piece of a sentence. It's not a complete sentence. It's as if you broke a glass on the floor and you had pieces of glass or fragments of glass all over the floor. Okay. And so by that analogy, a sentence fragment is a piece of a sentence, not a complete sentence. If you remember from our discussion about the sentence, a sentence requires a subject, which is a noun or a noun phrase or a pronoun, a predicate, which is a verb, and has to be a verb in the right form, and an independent clause. So the sentence requires all these things, and any sentence or anything pretending to be a sentence that is missing one of these requirements is a sentence fragment. We have to be especially aware of what a sentence fragment is, because this is a very major error in writing. One of the major errors in putting together formal writing. We cannot communicate in sentence fragments, and we'll talk a little bit about why that's so. And as well, in this sequence, we will be looking at how to recognize a sentence fragment and how to correct them. Okay, so now we'll continue. Thank you. As I said above, the sentence fragment is one of the most serious errors we can have in formal writing. And one of the problems that we encounter in correcting the sentence fragments or instances of sentence fragments in our sentences is that we very often speak in sentence fragments. And so they seem natural, and but we must eliminate them from our writing. So, but just to this point that we use it in speech, take a look at the example here of a possible or a sample exchange between two people. The first one says, "Team do okay? Kick butt. Okay, happy camper, huh?" Okay, so all those are fragments, but that is not an impossible dialogue between two people, probably guys, discussing the fate of one of them's favorite teams.
What about last night?
Caught a movie. You know, the one with the guy.
Any good?
All right. Kind of funny.
How about What's Her Face?
No, not at all.
Well, I would.
Maybe next time.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is one of the reasons that it's so difficult to correct sentence fragments and recognize them, and so we have to be alert to them, because the necessity to speak in a complete sentence is an artifact of writing, not of speech. And in the next slide, very briefly, I'll touch on another source of confusion about sentence fragments. The rule about fragments is not just an arbitrary rule. One of the reasons that we have such a rule in formal writing that fragments should not be used or cannot be used in this form of writing is that they can confuse, they can leave ambiguity, which means a confusion about what exactly is meant. So take a look at the example that we have over here. The policeman raced his patrol car, so angry he could spit. Period. Tom finally pulled over. You see, so who was so angry he could spit? Was it Tom or was it the policeman? You see, so it can lead to confusion. This is a very simple example, but because the the phrase, so angry he could spit, which is a sentence fragment, is not directly connected with anything and it's adjacent to two different ideas, it could modify either one. That is, the who is so angry could be attached to either the policeman or to Tom. So that's one of the reasons that that the fragment is not allowed in formal writing, because we need clarity and a lack of ambiguity. We need to be very definite about what it is that we're communicating and what it is that the reader understands from our writing. Something that might cause us some confusion is that a sentence fragment might actually give us a lot of information. So if you remember my conversation about the sentence, what qualifies a sentence as being a sentence is not the amount of information that it gives us. So the cat sat on the mat, for instance, is not disqualified as a sentence because we want to know where was the mat, what color was the mat, what color was the cat, what was the disposition of the cat, what was the name of the cat, what time of day was it, had the cat eaten its kibble yet, so all these other questions that we might be interested in do not disqualify that phrase, the cat sat on the mat, as a sentence. And in the same way, we could have a sentence or a fragment, a sentence fragment, that has some significant information in it, but still does not qualify as a sentence. And so we have an example here. After the coach encouraged him so much last year, and he seemed to improve with each passing game. See, that's a fragment. And we'll talk about what makes it a fragment. Even though it seems to have a lot of information in it, it is still a sentence fragment. So what determines whether something is a sentence or a fragment is not the amount of information that it has in the sentence. But there are other criteria, and quite objective criteria, rather than our judgment as to whether we're satisfied with the amount of information that's in the sentence or not. Another problem we might face in dealing with fragments is that we might be used to seeing them in other forms of writing besides academic writing and formal business correspondence, and even other forms of business writing, such as advertising, such as the examples that I have over here. On sale nationwide, the best way to find and book great travel deals, our biggest selection ever, all the essentials, and for less, and always punctuated with an exclamation point. Not always, but sometimes, quite often. So we're used to seeing these forms in writing, and writing that we see every day. So perhaps we don't pay attention to them in our forms of writing in which they're not allowed, but we should, we must. Perhaps another reason we might find it hard to recognize fragments in our formal writing is that even when we read fiction or poetry, even material that's considered great, we might encounter fragments, and so not recognize them as such, and not realize that these are forbidden in the forms of writing that we're discussing. So a couple of examples here. The poem by Ezra Pound, in a station of the Metro, which is a kind of a modern American haiku. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. Really a wonderful little poem, but it's a fragment. It's a sentence fragment. We have an example from James Joyce, the great early modern writer, novelist, who wrote, "Every life is many days, day after day. We walk through ourselves, meeting robbers, ghosts, giants, old men, young men, wives, widows, brothers in love, but always meeting ourselves." Now, that last phrase, punctuated as a sentence, but always meeting ourselves, is a sentence fragment. So, what do? We're used to seeing it in print. We're used to seeing fragments in print. We're used to hearing fragments in speech. But we must learn not to allow them into what's called our formal writing, either our academic writing or our business writing. So, as I noted above, as we have the requirements for a sentence, must have a subject, must have a predicate, and it must have an independent clause. So conversely, the common reasons for fragments is that it's missing a subject. It's missing the actor of the action. It's missing a predicate. That is, it's missing a verb. That actor is not doing something. We don't have the subject-verb relationship. Or it is entirely a subordinate clause or a dependent clause. It does not have an independent clause. So these are the reasons for sentence fragments. And as we go forward in this lesson right now, we're going to take a look at some examples and learn to identify sentence fragments for all of these reasons. We might identify the first reason for a sentence fragment is that the sentence, or the grouping of words that pretends to be a sentence, is missing a subject. It's missing the doer of the action. So we have a few examples here. Found the writer behind his desk cradling a bottle of whiskey. So that's interesting. Kind of an interesting picture. But who found the writer? You see, that's missing. Becomes too violent. Again, who becomes too violent? Or, although more satisfying than some, for the most part, is not satisfying enough. Well, again, what's more satisfying, or what's not satisfying enough? You see, so these are sentence fragments because they're missing a subject. Correcting a missing subject fragment is very simple. You simply add a subject. Subject's missing, add a subject. So the example that we have over here, the fragment embroiled in a scandal. Okay, so remember, we're missing a subject. So who was embroiled in a scandal? The governor was embroiled in a scandal. So do you see how that works? This is probably one of the easiest fragments to correct. So simply add a subject if the problem is that it's missing a subject. Another reason, or reason number two, for a sentence fragment is that the sentence, or the group of words pretending to be a sentence, is missing a predicate. That is a verb, and a verb acting in a central way in the sentence. And so we have a couple of examples here. The authors that the work was significant. Well, the authors what that the work was significant. They thought, they said, they claimed, they argued, they denied. You see, so we're missing an action here that's related to the authors, or it appears that it would be related to the authors. Or another example that we have, the bulls in the middle of the streets of Pamplona. What were the bulls doing in the middle of the street? What was being done to them? The bulls were running. The bulls were goring the people. The bulls were being tormented by the crowds. And if you don't know about the bulls running in the streets of Pamplona, if you can't get to Pamplona, Spain, very difficult word for me to say for some reason, look it up on YouTube. Very interesting and a little bit crazy. But anyway, but we have to know what the bulls are doing or what's being done to them, or else it's a sentence fragment. And so now we're going to go on to the next reason that we sometimes encounter sentence fragments or even create sentence fragments. And like we saw with the missing subject fragment, correcting a missing verb fragment is likewise easy. You simply add a verb. So the actor is doing something and not just sitting there. So the fragment that we have, the very fun image of the bulls in the middle of the streets of Pamplona, becomes the bulls stampeded in the middle of the streets of Pamplona. So you notice how we added the verb stampeded. Okay, so that's one way that we can correct a missing verb fragment. Now, perhaps another way would be to add a phrase with a verb in front of the bulls in the middle of the streets of Pamplona, such as the people taunted the bulls in the middle of the streets of Pamplona. You know, maybe the bulls in the middle of the streets of Pamplona is not the actor that we want to focus on. But at any rate, correcting a missing verb fragment has to do with inserting a verb, and so we have a subject-verb relationship somewhere in the sentence. So another reason for a sentence fragment is the sentence, or again, to be tedious, the group of words that's pretending to be a sentence, it does not have an independent clause. And if you remember back to our discussion about the independent clause, an independent clause is a clause that has a subject and a predicate, and it does not begin with one of the subordinating conjunctions, such as if we look over here, we'll see the sentence, the boy hit the ball. But what is not a sentence is if the boy hit the ball, or when the boy hit the ball, or though the boy hit the ball. All those beginning words that I've highlighted in red are subordinating conjunctions, sometimes called dependent conjunctions. And if our sentence is composed only of that clause, then it is not a sentence. It's a dependent conjunction and needs something else. Now, in the next slide, we'll take a look at a couple of ways to fix that condition. Correcting the no independent clause fragment can be done in two different ways, and I'll go over these, and we have a couple of examples over here. Remember that in the text there are several other examples, as well as at the end of this whole exercise, you'll be invited to take the check your knowledge exercise. But the no independent clause fragment is a fragment that has what appears to be a sentence. It has a clause that is a group of words that has a subject and a predicate. But the problem is that it contains a subordinate conjunction which governs or rules that that clause, and therefore can't qualify as an independent clause. So the example that we have, because it's dangerous to play in the street, period. Okay, so what because it's dangerous to play in the street? Now, if I said that to you, because it's dangerous to play in the street, you go, what? So we shouldn't play in the street, or we should block the street. You see, so there's a lot of different possibilities. But so there's two ways to correct this. One, we can just simply delete the subordinating conjunction, delete the because, and just simply say it's dangerous to play in the street. The other way to correct this problem, this fragment, is to add an independent clause. So because it's dangerous to play in the street, I want you to stay in the backyard. Okay, so I want you to stay in the backyard, which I've highlighted in red over here, is the independent clause and helps that dependent clause form a complete sentence. Okay, so remember, there's two ways to correct a no independent clause fragment. One is just to delete the word, that is the conjunction, the dependent conjunction that makes it a dependent clause, or to add an independent clause, to complete the thought by adding an independent clause. Reason number 4 for a sentence fragment is that the verb is incomplete. So we're almost at a sentence, but the verb isn't quite right. So again, if we look at the examples, we can see an example such as stress injuries caused by carrying heavy loads. Well, the complete verb would have to be are caused by carrying heavy loads, or can be caused. You see, so the verb isn't complete, and so it's not a sentence. Another example would be seamen dying of scurvy. Well, again, were dying, are dying, have been dying. You see, we have to complete the verb. So, and without that complete verb, it's not just a verb in any old form. It has to be a complete verb. And of course, we have to have a verb that agrees with the subject. But without that, we have a sentence fragment. And ultimately, we have to correct it. And before we get to the end of this lesson today, we'll be talking about various ways to correct these conditions. To correct the wrong verb fragment, very simply, we have to put the verb in the correct form. And very often, this kind of error is just simply because we forget a helping verb. We miss it in our original writing, and we don't pick it up in our proofreading. But the example that we have here, okay, is that concussions caused by playing football without a helmet. Okay, so that verb caused is not in the correct form. So there's a number of different ways to correct this. Concussions can't be caused by playing football without a helmet. Concussions were caused by playing football without a helmet. Concussions have been caused by playing football without a helmet. And of course, we can also use that fragment as a noun phrase. Concussions caused by playing football without a helmet should be corrected by outlawing the game of football. So please don't throw anything at the screen. If you happen to love football, that's just an illustration. It's not a position that I'm necessarily advocating. Okay, so you can use that phrase, concussions caused by playing football without a helmet, as a noun phrase that becomes the subject of an entirely new sentence, or you can complete the verb. Okay, so now we'll go on to the next item. Thank you. So the next reason we have for a sentence fragment is that we have a phrase lacking the structure of a sentence, and even though it might communicate some sort of information, it's not a sentence. It doesn't have the subject-verb relationship. And some of these fall into the category of the examples that I gave above, used in advertising or fiction for emphasis, such as somehow in the middle of all this, on sale nationwide, from coast to coast, over the bridge and through the woods, running down the field as fast as he could. And so each one of those is a sentence fragment. It lacks the structure of a sentence, and more importantly, or more specifically, it lacks a subject-verb relationship and an independent clause. So it's just a phrase, and even though it has a bunch of words in it, and those words might convey some sort of significant information to us, they're not sentences. From the slide previous, we saw how many fragments are phrases. They don't have any subject or verb relationship at all in them. And so using the examples that we had above, I've constructed a few example sentences from them, and you'll see the phrases highlighted in red and the independent clause that's attached to them underlined. So somehow in the middle of this, which you remember was, one of the phrases, somehow in the middle of this, I managed to keep my sanity. This revolutionary product is on sale nationwide. So that on sale nationwide would be, the phrase, and sometimes we might see it isolated as a sentence by itself in a piece of advertising, but not suitable for formal writing. So this revolutionary product is on sale nationwide. Our show is broadcast from coast to coast, over the bridge and through the woods to grandmother's house we go. And so that simple we go is an independent clause. It has a subject and a verb, okay, a subject and a predicate. So the whole sentence is complete now. And running down the field as fast as he could, Jones eluded the onrushing tacklers. So that is a complete sentence now because we've added the independent clause, Jones eluded the onrushing tacklers. So correcting the phrase fragment is sometimes just as simple as adding a independent clause to the phrase and completing the thought, and as well as supplying the necessary subject, predicate, and independent clause. Now, related to number 5, and so this is either reason number 6 or it's reason 5A or B or however you want to count. Anyway, but related to the phrases are sentences or phrases that are separated from the whole sentence, and very often for emphasis. And so we have some examples here. Again, his final words were published, period, 3 days after his death. So you notice that 3 days after his death is punctuated as if it were a sentence, but it's not. And it really goes with what came before, with the complete sentence that goes before. But it's incorrectly punctuated as if it were a sentence, and so it's a sentence fragment. And we can see in the corrected version, his final words were published 3 days after his death, okay, without that sentence break there. Another example that we have is, I was time warped, period, cast backwards into June. Okay, so here, we have this phrase that's separated from the sentence, probably for emphasis, probably for drama, but you can't do that in formal writing. You would have to write something like, I was time warped and cast backwards to last June. Okay, I was time warped and cast backwards to last June. You see, so there we have the complete sentence and not the fragment that's broken off and made to stand by itself. As I indicated above, the incorrectly separated phrase fragment can be easily fixed by simply joining the incorrectly separated phrase to the independent clause to the main sentence. So here we have the example. Babe Ruth was well known, full stop, period, for his partying as well as his playing. So now that's second part of that example, for his partying as well as his playing, is a sentence fragment. But we should see that we can easily join that fragment to the independent clause, to the sentence, Babe Ruth was well known, and create the complete sentence, Babe Ruth was well known for his partying as well as his playing. Okay, so very simple fix here. Just delete the period, lowercase the, in this case, the capital F, and we have a complete sentence. So in this lesson, we've taken a look at what a fragment is, why it's considered serious, and the different forms that the fragment can take. And it's surprising. One little error can occur in so many different ways. But I hope that we've learned from this, and as well we've learned how to correct this occurrence of the sentence fragment in our own writing. And again, I'll remind you that you can read the text that's accompanying this lesson. You can also take the Test Your Knowledge exercise that's also attached. And of course, if you have any questions, please feel free to get in touch with me and make your inquiry. But thank you very much, and I'll see you next time.